This is what clued me in originally. It was 2004. I was 24 and a half years old. And that was the first time I had ever heard of that. And literally within about 10 minutes of starting to read about it, I suddenly realized that it was me. And it put the rest, about 24, a little more, about 20 years of questions that I had about myself. And so things finally culminated a year later when I finally got my diagnosis after having my third, or actually I should say after having my fourth evaluation from doctors and psychologists and other various professionals who saw me over the years. This was the fourth diagnosis that it took, and finally they got it right. My parents kept journals. This is a entry where I did some injury to myself. This was during that era. There's a date. Where I was hurting myself when I was getting upset. And you gotta remember that this was kind of back in the time before they had diagnoses and all that other stuff. This was like DSM-3R era, and you would think that being diagnosed as late as I was diagnosed at 25, that it would be a rather difficult transition to make, or particularly traumatic one. But when I think back on it, being diagnosed as an adult, it probably wasn't the worst thing that could have happened to me. Because I remember how I was when I was 10 or 11 and I had the ADHD diagnosis on me, and I just absolutely hated it to no extent. I used to get really mad when people would say that I had it at school and make fun of me because of it, because it was a label and I didn't want labels. I had spent so much time, so much effort of my childhood doing my best to work with what I had to try and appear normal to other people, that it just absolutely irritated the living daylights out of me when people pointed out stuff like that. And thinking back on it, you know, had I been born 20 years later or even 30 years later, and I was in the same spot 30 years ago today, I probably would have been in a really bad funk, because, you know, we have the internet and I would have read about all that stuff, and I just knew how I felt back then, and had what I read about autism and stuff applied to something today, to me as a 7-year-old, I absolutely would have been just in a horrible funk, because that kind of thing, to read some of the stuff that you read and the prospects and all that other stuff, I just would have sunk really, really low. Because I really, as a kid, did my best to try and appear normal to other people, and it just never went the way that I wanted it to, or even so much as just trying to just actually put myself out there was hard for me to do. And to be an adult, it felt like, you know, once I got to be an adult and I saw my peers moving on and I was getting nowhere, it really felt like my life was, it was a vacuum, it was a dream. I was in a dreamland. And had I known it back then, just thinking how I was, you know, when I was 17, 18, 19, 20. Well, for starters, when I was 17, 18, 19, 20, and my parents booted me out of the house, I would not have been able to keep a roof over my head or keep a job. I just didn't have that ability in me to do that. And it probably would not have ended well. But instead what wound up happening was that I ended up going forward in life knowing that something was wrong with me, but not understanding what or why or how. And, you know, being the good being the good autistic, that I am, I took a very empirical approach to things and used science, or used scientific method to try and figure out how I could improve myself, because I was under the impression at the time, when I was in my early 20s, that all my problems were my fault. I had no idea that there was something, going on here with the way that my brain was working that was causing it. I figured it was because, I was the introvert who never did anything. I never learned those social skills. I knew what was going on with me. I knew. But I just couldn't put the button on, I couldn't put my finger on the button that was the answer to what was going on. And when that day came around in 2004, when I finally, uncovered the truth, it was like, if you could ever imagine going to, like the most difficult challenge you've ever had to face in your life, and that you were successful in doing so, and the relief that you felt, imagine that relief times 10. That's kind of how I felt. And I think that day came at the right time, because I was getting ready for a change in my life, and I was going to be moving off to Oshkosh to finish up college, and I was going to be on my own for the first time. And I think it was a very fortuitous time in my life to have that happen, because had I not known about that, I probably would not have gotten through university like I did, as good as I did. I got through with a 3.0 GPA, believe it or not. Although I was only taking a 3/4 class load. That's a little bit of cheating on my part, but who's counting? Grades are grades, so. It's not necessarily a bad thing to be diagnosed later in life. At least it was for me. And that's just my take on it. That's what all these videos are. It's just my take on stuff. So if you like it, please like, comment, and subscribe. And